Watts, Los Angeles, September 8, 1967. People thought Jimi Hendrix had come to the Avalon Social Club like everyone else, just to pay respects on a memorial night, but the truth was something else entirely. The woman at the door looked him over. $5 donation, baby, she said. Everything goes to the family. The man across from her reached into his jacket without a word and placed a folded bill on the table. What she didn't know was this. Jimi Hendrix had not come to the Avalon Social Club to pay respects to a man he had never met. He had come because 3 weeks ago, a musician named Calvin Broussard had told him about a young guitarist in Watts whose father had just died and who was planning to sell his guitar to help cover the funeral costs. And that detail, the guitar being sold, had not left Jimi Hendrix alone since he heard it. Inside, the air was thick with grief and food and the specific warmth of a community holding itself together. Carnations on every table, white and yellow. A photograph of the deceased on the far wall. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s wearing a suit that had been pressed carefully for the photograph, smiling the smile of someone who did not smile easily and meant it when he did. Candles below the photograph. The smell of black-eyed peas and cornbread from the kitchen. Underneath it all, something else. The particular heaviness that sits in a room where everyone is trying to be strong for someone else and nobody has yet been allowed to simply be broken. 80 people, maybe more. Children running between adults who were too occupied with grief to redirect them. Old men in good hats sitting in the corners, not saying much. Women moving between tables with plates and purpose. The specific efficiency of people who have learned that feeding others is the most useful form of love available when nothing else can be done. Jimi Hendrix found a chair near the back wall and sat. He had come without announcement, without the embroidered shirts of his stage presence. Tonight, he wore a plain, dark jacket, a simple collar, nothing that would draw a second look. He was 24 years old and recognizable to people who were looking for him. Nobody in this room was looking for him. They were looking at the photograph on the wall and at each other and at the door every time it opened, the way people look at doors at wakes, half expecting someone who is not coming. The band set up at 9. 4 pieces, drums, bass, keys, and guitar. The guitarist was the one Jimi Hendrix had come to see. David Ellis was 22 years old, wearing a dark suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders, the suit of someone who had borrowed formality for an occasion that required it. His guitar was a 1959 Gibson ES-335 in Sunburst, a beautiful instrument, the kind of guitar that a young musician in Watts in 1967 didn't acquire easily. It had belonged to his father. The old man had played it on weekends, in church basements, and at neighborhood gatherings for 20 years. The finish on the cutaway was worn where his father's arm had rested. The neck had been refretted once. The pickguard had a crack along the bottom edge that had been there since 1961 and had never been repaired because it didn't affect the sound and therefore didn't matter. David Ellis had been about to sell it. The funeral home had required a deposit. There were 3 younger sisters and a mother who worked 2 jobs and a stack of bills that grief did not pause. The guitar was the most valuable thing in the apartment. David Ellis had made an appointment at a pawn shop on Central Avenue for the following Monday. Calvin Broussard had heard about the appointment and had called Jimi Hendrix. That was 3 weeks ago. Jimi Hendrix sat in the back of the Avalon Social Club and looked at the ES-335 in David Ellis's hands and saw 20 years of a dead man's weekends in the wear pattern on the finish. He looked at David Ellis's hands and saw the sun. The hands were a musician's hands, genuine calluses on the right fingertips, the left hand showing the specific muscle development that comes from years of serious chord work. But the hands also showed something else. The skin on the right palm was thickened and slightly discolored in a way that suggested regular contact with cleaning chemicals. The left wrist had a small scar, white and old, the kind of scar that accumulates in kitchens where knives and hot surfaces and the speed of service industry work produce small, permanent marks on the people who do it. David Ellis was washing dishes or bussing tables or mopping floors somewhere during the hours when he was not playing this guitar or grieving this man. The band opened with a gospel standard, "His Eye is on the Sparrow," and the room received it the way rooms receive music at wakes, which is to say gratefully and with the specific permission that grief gives music to reach places that ordinary occasions protect against. Several of the older women in the room were already crying before the first verse was finished. The old men in the good hats kept their eyes on the photograph. David Ellis played through the gospel standard with complete technical control. Jimi Hendrix watched his hands and heard the control and heard what was underneath the control, which was the specific effort of someone who was holding something back. Not emotion in the general sense, but the particular form of emotion that comes from playing your dead father's guitar at your dead father's memorial in front of everyone who loved your dead father, and being the one responsible for making the music good enough that it honors him properly. The second song was a blues ballad. David Ellis's father had loved blues. Calvin Broussard had told Jimi Hendrix this, and the song choice confirmed it. 3 bars into the melody, something happened in David Ellis's right hand. It was small. It was invisible to most of the room. But Jimi Hendrix, from the back wall, saw it. The bow hold loosened slightly. Not a technical failure. The notes continued, clean and in time. But the grip changed. The way a grip changes when the body is doing something it is doing on pure training, and the mind has gone somewhere else. Somewhere that is not the stage and not the room and not the 80 people in their grief and their borrowed formality. The 3rd bar ended. The 4th bar began. David Ellis stopped playing. He did not say anything. He did not hold up a hand or address the room. He simply stopped. His right hand fell to his side. His left hand remained on the neck of the ES-335, fingers still forming the chord shape. He stood at the microphone with the guitar in a playing position, and his right hand at his side and his eyes closed. 5 seconds. 10. The drummer stopped. The bassist stopped. The keys player hit one last note that died in the room. The room was very quiet. David Ellis opened his eyes. He looked at the photograph on the wall. He said, not into the microphone, not to the room, simply to the photograph. I can't. 2 words. Quiet enough that the people at the nearest tables heard them. Quiet enough that they carried the specific weight of words said to someone who cannot hear them, which is a weight different from any other. Then David Ellis unstrapped the ES-335. He held it for a moment in both hands, the way you hold something whose weight you are committing to memory. He carried it to the stand and set it down and walked to the side exit, the door that led to the corridor behind the social club's main room, and went through it. Jimi Hendrix was out of his chair before the door closed. The corridor was short and plain, a service space between the main room and the kitchen, lit by a fluorescent tube that was functioning properly for once. David Ellis was standing at the far end beside a stack of folding chairs, the ES-335's strap still across his shoulder from when he had picked the guitar back up without thinking as he came through the door. He heard footsteps. He turned. Jimi Hendrix said, "I know about the pawn shop." David Ellis looked at him. The embroidered shirt was absent. The hat was plain. But there was something in the face, a quality of specific attention, of someone who was here because they had decided to be here and had known before they arrived what they were going to find. David Ellis said, "Calvin told you." Jimi Hendrix said, "Yes." David Ellis looked at the guitar in his hands. He said, "The deposit was $300. I had $200. He said it the way you state facts when you're past the point of embarrassment about them, simply as information. He said, "It's a nice guitar. Somebody will take care of it." Jimi Hendrix crossed the corridor and stood beside David Ellis. He reached out and put his hand on the body of the ES-335. Not taking it, just touching it. The worn finish on the cutaway, the place where 20 years of a man's arm had rested. He said, "Your father played this every week?" David Ellis said, "Sundays, sometimes Saturdays." He said, he learned 3 songs when he bought it. Played those 3 songs for 20 years. He wasn't technical. He stopped. He said, he just loved it. Jimi Hendrix said, "It shows." He reached into the inside pocket of his plain jacket and took out a folded envelope. He held it out to David Ellis. He said, "Cancel the Monday appointment." David Ellis looked at the envelope. He did not take it immediately. He said, "I don't know you." Jimi Hendrix said, "You know the guitar." He said, "Your father kept this for 20 years because it was worth keeping." He looked at David Ellis. He said, "So are you. Cancel the appointment." David Ellis took the envelope. He held it without opening it. His eyes were full, but he did not let them over. The specific controlled grief of someone who has been holding it all night for everyone else and is now being offered permission to stop. Jimi Hendrix said, "Go back in there and play." He said, "Play it the way he played it. 3 songs, 20 years, just because he loved it. That's enough." He said, "That's everything." David Ellis stood in the corridor for another 30 seconds. Then he straightened the strap of the ES 335. He walked back to the door. He paused with his hand on it. He looked back at Jimi Hendrix. He said, "Who are you?" Jimi Hendrix said, "Someone who almost sold his first guitar." He said, "Go play." David Ellis went back through the door. The room had been waiting in the specific suspension of a gathering that has been interrupted and does not know yet whether it will resume. When David Ellis walked back to the microphone, the room understood, before he played a note, that something had happened in the corridor and that the something had resolved in a direction worth receiving. He picked up where he had stopped, the blues ballad, 3rd bar, 4th bar, the place where his right hand had fallen. This time it did not fall. This time the hand moved through the 4th bar and the 5th and the 6th with the quality that Jimi Hendrix had heard in the gospel standard, the technical control, and also with something new underneath it, the specific release of someone who has been holding a thing and has been shown that they are allowed to set it down. The room cried. Not performing crying, not the polite grief of obligation, but the real kind. The kind that comes when music does what it is supposed to do, which is reach the place below thought where everything that needs to be felt has been waiting. Jimi Hendrix stood at the back of the room and watched David Ellis play his father's guitar at his father's memorial and did not go back to his chair. He stood near the door until the set was finished, when the room began to rise and move toward David Ellis with condolences and embrace. Jimi Hendrix set to reach jury slipped through the exit and into the Watts night. David Ellis opened the envelope in the kitchen at 1 in the morning when the room had mostly emptied. The folded bills were enough and more than enough. There was a plain card inside, a handwritten address, a phone number, and 1 sentence. "When you're ready." No name. He knew the name by the following morning when he described what had happened to Calvin Broussard. He called the number on the card 3 weeks later. The man who answered said, "I wondered when you'd call." He said, "Bring the guitar." David Ellis brought the guitar. He did not sell it. He has not sold it. The appointment at the pawn shop on Central Avenue was canceled on a Sunday night in September 1967, and the ES 335 that had belonged to a broad-shouldered man who loved 3 songs for 20 years remained in the family and remained in use and carries on its cutaway, the wear mark of an arm that is no longer there, which is the specific kind of permanence that music makes possible and nothing else does. The people who had been in the Avalon Social Club that night described the moment David Ellis stopped playing in terms that were remarkably consistent, not in their description of what happened, which was simple and visible, but in their description of what it felt like, which was the feeling of something private becoming public in a way that the room had no prepared response for. One of the older women who had been sitting in the second row said, "I've been to 100 wakes. I've heard music played at all of them. I've seen musicians struggle, and I've seen musicians soar, and I've seen everything in between. I have never seen a young man stop in the middle of a song and speak to his father's photograph, and then be still in the way David Ellis was still." She said, "It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a collapse. It was something more specific than those words. It was a young man saying the only honest thing available to him in that moment, which was that there are some performances that cannot be given, not because of lack of ability, but because the performance itself is asking for something that hasn't been released yet." She said, when he came back through that door, something had been released. I don't know what happened in that corridor, but I know the difference between a musician playing through grief and a musician playing from grief. The second half of that set was the second kind. Calvin Broussard, who had made the call to Jimi Hendrix 3 weeks before the memorial night and who had been at the Avalon Social Club that evening without making his presence known to either of them, said he watched the whole sequence from a position near the kitchen door. He had watched Jimi Hendrix arrive and find the back wall and sit. He had watched David Ellis play the first 2 songs and begin the third. He had seen the right hand fall. He had seen the two words to the photograph. He had seen Jimi Hendrix rise from his chair before the exit door had finished closing. Calvin Broussard said, "I called Jimi Hendrix because I knew the guitar and I knew what selling it would cost. I didn't know if Jimi Hendrix would come or what he would do. I only knew that if there was anyone who would understand what was being lost, it was Jimi Hendrix." He said, "The envelope in the corridor. I didn't expect that. I should have. That's who Jimi Hendrix was. Not someone who watched things that should be kept from going away, someone who did something about it.